Hello everybody, my name is Mariusz Skrobała. Welcome to my channel on YouTube, CONSERVATIO. And today joining me from Milan in Italy, Luca Siniscalco from Julius Evola Foundation. Hello, Luca.
Hello, Marius. Thank you very much for the invitation.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. It's the third time we are meeting on video to discuss the work and life of Julius Evola. And Luca, today, one of his most fascinating books, in my opinion, that's Metaphysics of War. This is an edition by Arctos. There's another one in hardcover. And Luca, from the start, in fact, it's not a book published by Evola, it's a compilation of his text from different magazines, texts written in the 1930s, 1940s. And from what I know, the first edition in Italian was done by the famous publishing house Edizioni Dar, owned by famous Franco Freda. Can you tell us a little about the story of this book?
Yes, you are perfectly right. The English edition published by Arctos is the translation of the book Metafisica della Guerra, Metaphysics of War, which has been published by Edizioni DR and edited by one of the first philosophers who in Italy has given the right attention to Evola's philosophy, who is Roberto Melchionda, who has written a very interesting preface, who unfortunately has not been translated in English, but is part of the Italian edition. Melchionda has written also in Italian one of the first books devoted to Evola's philosophy, who has recently been republished in a new edition by Julius Evola Foundation. The book by Melchionda is entitled The Face of Dionysus. It's a fascinating title who refers to Evola's spiritual path. And as you have mentioned, Edizioni DR is a publishing house who has a long history. Indeed, it was founded around 60 years ago, in 1963, in Padua, by Franco Freda, a figure associated with the post-war Italian radical right, along with a small group of friends and associates influenced by the philosophy of Julius Evola. The name R was chosen for its symbolic and linguistic resonance with concepts, with aristocratic concepts. Such it was the root of the word arete, which refers to the physical and moral vigor of the Greek nobles and aristocrats. Since its founding, Edizioni DR has published works by traditionalist and radical thinkers, including Julius Evola, René Guénon, focusing especially on interesting collections of essays and articles which Evola published in several magazines and which they collected in order to give to contemporary reader the opportunity to know them, because the old magazines and newspapers were no longer available. And the traditionalist milieu is not the only interest of Edizioni DR, which has devoted many efforts also to other areas related to the thought of tradition, the political far-right traditional production, but also other philosophical areas such as the history of Indo-Europeans, also and also other authors. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was one of the favorite philosophers of Franco Freda, has been offered in a new translation with many of his texts. And yeah, in this context, we can find also Metaphysics of War, which represents a collection of different articles written by Evola between 1935 and 1950, and published mainly in the so-called Diorama Filosofico, who was a section of the journal Il Regime Fascista, directed by Roberto Farinacci. And Il Regime Fascista was the official publication of the fascist party in Italy. And despite some problems which Evola encountered in the previous years with the government, because Evola's position was not so aligned with the fascist government of the first years of the 30s, although not so many people are aware of that. For example, Evola tried a personal publication called La Torre, the Tower, who encountered a strong criticism by many fascist intellectuals. But despite of that, Farinacci, who was a man of great culture, really estimated Evola's perspective and critical thinking. And so he gave him this important official space in his journal with a lot of free space to express his thought, writing articles, but also hosting text and pieces written by other friends and collaborators of Evola. There are also some articles in this collection who comes from different journals, for example, from the periodical La Difesa della Razza, or the last one from 1950 comes from Meridiano d'Italia, who was another journal. So it's this volume, Metaphysics of War, has a really, I will say, complex structure, but reflects cultural, metapolitical, and spiritual interest, which characterize Evola production for at least these 15 years hereby considered. And that's important because it shows a strong engagement of Evola with the topic of war.
Yes. If you allow me, I will go back a little bit. You've talked about the book The Face of Dionysius by Roberto Malchionda. Yes, that's the name.
Yes.
Has that book been published in English?
No.
But it's devoted to Evola, yeah?
Yes, I think it's really one of the first book written on Evola, and especially from a philosophical point of view, because Melchionda, of course, he was a scholar within Evola's milieu, so he was somehow near Evola's position, and he was not an academic, instead independent researcher, but was one of the first to study Evola, not firstly from a political perspective, but starting methodologically from the discussion of his philosophical thesis. So the major section of the book I've mentioned is devoted to Evola magical idealism. So, and then it connects Evola philosophical speculation with his participation to the artistic movement of Dada, but also to the traditionalist phase.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting attempt to recognize a philosophical unity within the complex production of Evola, who often is too simply divided, in the different phases. Yeah. And according to Melchionda, there is a fil rouge, a common line, which allows to unify the whole Evola's perspective through a philosophical gaze.
Yeah, hopefully it will be translated into English, as there is not a lot of books about Evola in this language, unfortunately. But he's getting more and more popular, especially thanks to the editions of Arctos. That's why I'm talking about it, because I know this book from the English translation, of course. We've also mentioned Franco Freda, who is a legendary figure in the history of modern Italy, intellectual, but also a member of the radical right, famous for his actions also during the years of Lead. Can you tell us a little bit more about that figure?
Yeah, Freda is a complex figure who required much more time and also historical preparation to discuss his role and his perspective in the Italian politics. But as a short presentation, I can say that his perspective associated with the Italian far right was specifically connected to his own political reading of Evola's traditionalism. And so it was understood by him as an attempt to translate Evola's philosophy and metapolitical view in the current Italian political situation. He was born in Padova, I mean, Italian city of the Northeast, and he created the Edizioni di Art also at the beginning with a bookshop in Padova in order to create a group of people intended to be culturally and metapolitically educated, and then in order to translate traditionalism into political activism. He subsequently had a very complex lived a very complex legal situation, because it was condemned for the famous Piazza Fontana event, the Piazza Fontana bombing or massacre, as I think it could be translated in English. But the his activities were then legally persecuted for several years. He always maintained the work of Edizioni di Art, which had several collaborators, among them Roberto Melchionda, whom I have quoted, and many other scholars in the context of Evola's studies. For example, also Edizioni di Art hosted also contribution from Piero Divona, who was an academic, a scholar, professor in south of Italy, who has no far-right origin, but who firstly studied Spinoza and then moved to Evola's philosophy, and he found in Edizioni di Art the right place to publish his studies. And this testify, however, I would say a open perspective by this, by the cultural context of these editions. Freda attempt also to participate again in Italian political life subsequently in the 19th, I think. But then he dedicated himself just to the cultural activity through this edition. Yeah, this is the short introduction I'm able now to deliver to your audience.
Yes. I think it's not a coincidence that there was an interest in this kind of text by Julius Evola during those turbulent times, during that era that is known in Italian history as years of lead, those clashes between the political right and the political left. That's a very interesting subject on its own, but please let us go to the book itself. The main subject is war and the heroic spirit in the view of the world of tradition. And if you allow me, I will write and I will read a part from it that could be interesting for our listeners and could bring us all into the subject. The part comes from an essay called The Forms of Warlike Heroism, and Evola writes, the fundamental principle underlying all justification of war from the point of view of human personality is heroism. War, it is said, offers man the opportunity to awaken the hero who sleeps within him. War breaks the routine of comfortable life. By means of its severe ordeals, it offers a transfiguring knowledge of life, life according to death. The moment the individual succeeds in living as a hero, even if it's the final moment of his earthly life, weighs infinitely more on the scale of values than a protracted existence spent consuming monotonously among the trivialities of cities. From a spiritual point of view, these possibilities make up for the negative and destructive tendencies of war, which are one-sidedly and tendenciously highlighted by pacifist materialism. Work makes one realize the real relativity of human life and therefore also the law of more than life, and thus war has always an anti-materialist value, a spiritual value.
Yes, this quotation is really powerful, I think. Is one you have done the right choice because it's one probably of the most beautiful and impressive within the book. And I think it's useful to let emerge the fundamental perspective through which Evola reads the experience of the war. War conceived as instrument of awakening. So the philosophical focus which Evola adopts in reading the war is the idea that this event, which has always characterized from the origin of our history, the life of man, is that of create a division between the routinary, ordinary, materialistic life and a radical experience, which allows man to experience something more, to experience a sort of immanent transcendence, a situation which which induce men to express the best of their spiritual condition, letting emerge that values connected to heroism, sacrifice, respect, openness to the transcendence, which according to Evola are the fundamental aristocratic value which are at the core of his traditionalist ethics. The value of self-sacrifice, indeed, which human can apply, of course, also in situations outside the war context, is something which finds its metaphysical justification precisely in the conviction that there is something which demands to, due to its value, to sacrifice our own life, our individual life. And this something more is precisely the dimension of the divine, of transcendence. In Revolt Against Modern World, Evola distinguished between two dimensions of reality, the world of being and the world of becoming, adopting a Platonian distinction. And the world of being, that eternal, fixed, sacred dimension, demands to man the recognition that the daily common materialistic life is something which pertains just to becoming, and the situation of risk, such as the context of war, helps man to recognize the fragility and impermanence which characterize the ontological structure of phenomenical reality. And if the warrior is that kind of man who is spiritually capable of recognizing his own impermanence and the necessity to affirm that eternal values, which represents the ethical translation of the metaphysical principle. That's why, for example, Evola quotes, I think more than one times in the writings which are part of this collection, the famous Latin expression vita est militia super terram, which we can roughly translate as life is fighting on the earth.
Permanent struggle, yes, something like that.
But the concept of militia is more than fight and struggle, is really the adoption in our ethical and existential behavior of that values which make us being a milites, which in Latin means warrior, and which is also distinguished by Evola from the soldier. The soldier is technically the man who fight, but it is somehow a profession, while the warrior is soldiers can be warriors, but also everyone can become a warrior when he's ready to fight, to sacrifice to eternal values his own individual life. And according to Evola, this is also a very important point of this book. The warrior is an archetypal figure, so we can recognize the same anthropology, which is a vertical anthropology because it connects the earth with the sky, the material with the spiritual, appears in all the traditional cultures and civilizations. So there are many information which Evola offers to the reader, taken from very different cultures from the West, but also from the East, which allow to theorize a sort of universal archetype of the warrior, which in some texts here collected, according to Evola, is particularly prominent into the Indo-European tradition. But as we know, that kind of primordial tradition, due to the movement of this population, created historical civilization both in Europe, in Asia. So we can recognize, despite the profound cultural and also religious differences, several similarities between the warriors in the traditional civilization. The real distinction takes place, according to Evola, in the crisis and decline, which characterize the transition from the traditional civilization to the modern ones, where this ethics of the warrior tends to disappear or to be substituted by sort of fake ethic of the fake warrior. So because wars, as we know, and as unfortunately we are still living, are still there and they are still taking place, but outside this metaphysical perspective, just as a materialistic clash of economical interest or political agendas. And Evola is deeply criticizing this reduction of war to a mere political or economical instrument. In this sense, although Evola has been criticized by many readers due to the so defined risks of giving to the tragic phenomenon of war a positive role. Indeed, if we rightly read his pages, there is no celebration of violence. Instead, there is the attitude of Evola is to recognize that war, that if we want or not, is taking place, and there is a traditional way of living this phenomenon which allows to reduce the violence and to adopt to give to the war, at least in its tragedy, the opportunity to become an instrument for man's awakening, to man's education, to man's spiritual growth. And this could be the function of the war, which of course has a tragical aspect connected to violence, death, conflict, but when thought can be in this perspective recognized in its symbolic and metaphysical meaning.
Yes, and I think there is one thing that we have to put an emphasis on. As there is a distinction between the world of tradition and the modern world, there is also a distinction between the war in the world of the tradition and the modern warfare that's using machines and killing people in huge numbers. And Evola is not praising the modern world and its form of war. He's praising the heroic spirit of the traditional war. And in one of this text here, Varieties of Heroism, he writes about the war in the Bolshevik era, but it's very modern style war. So it's titled Bolshevik Subpersonhood. It is now well known that Soviet Russia conduct of war does not attach the slightest importance to human life or to humanity as such. For them, the combatants are nothing but human material in the most brutal sense of this sinister expression, a sense which unfortunately has now become widespread in a certain sort of military literature. But it's not only the Bolsheviks that did it during the 20th century. The Second World War was a war without any boundaries, where people were killed in millions using machines and using some modern ideologies to destroy humanity wherever it came. There's a huge distinction between First and Second World War. The First World War is used to be called the last aristocratic war of Europe, and it didn't destroy any big cities or didn't kill people, civilians in millions. The Second World War was completely different, yeah. And Evola, in was one of the last essays in this book, is mentioning Ernst Junger and his notions that machines are not being used by people anymore. Machines are using people and diminishing that human human aspect in life. So that's the huge difference between the war in the world of tradition, where two heroic spirits meet in the battlefield, eye into eye, and the modern war that's using machine on mass scale and is killing civilians and people. And a man means nothing in that war, it's just another number.
Yes, well, your comment is really important, and you are completely right in emphasizing this Evola comment. And I think a great example of a traditional war is represented among the several examples provided by Evola by the Crusades, which are mentioned and used as argument by Evola in a very, I think, original way, because he's not on the traditionalist Christian, sometimes a bit fanatic position of saying, okay, of course we praise for the Crusades because they were fighting the bad Muslim with their fanatic ideology, but he recognized the value of both the armies because he states that, of course, the two religions and the two people were fighting each against other, also with violence and brutality, but in both perspective, their view of the war was based on a sacred interpretation of the world. And this sacredness was reflected also in the ethics of the warriors, who usually tend, as you have noticed, to adopt at least some ethical behaviors within the war and the fight, attributing to their actions a symbolic and spiritual value. And so we could a little bit paradoxically speak of a sort of ecumenism of the war. So when living traditions and identities fight each against other, there is violence, but it's also a chance to meet each other in the fight, to know each other, to define the borders, the respective identity. And usually after the war comes the peace and period of separation or dialogue. And especially what Evola underlines is that the existential experience of these warriors, both the Christian and the Muslim, allow them to reach a spiritual awakening, to experience that heroic dimension of life which otherwise is neglected. And what I can maybe add is that, as you have already introduced, according to Evola, there is an evolution of the worldview on the war, which depends on the age transition. And somehow is it possible, according to Evola, to define 4 different conceptions of war, depending on the social class ruling in that period, and reproducing somehow the same historical process of decline, which characterized in traditionalist interpretation the transition from the Golden Age to the Kali Yuga, to the last age. Indeed, in one article within this collection, Evola recognized these 4 different steps, which in Revolt Against the Modern World are, of course, better explained and structured. According to him, in the Golden Age, we have the sacred aristocratic states with the structure of empires, and there is a perfect identity between the war as political phenomenon and the war as spiritual reality. Then we have the second stage with the monarchic states, which still preserve aristocratic traditional values, but somehow they are no more in the golden age. So there is still the distinction between the orders, for example, the Templars, where this connection between spirituality and army was preserved, and other military contexts where it started to disappear. Then we have the third phase with the modern capitalistic oligarchic states, which we could say maybe it could be interesting to debate, but are still now the main models of our contemporary age, which practice war just for the for practical, economical, oligarchic interest. So here there is no more connection between these ethics of warrior and the concrete activities of the army. And then, according to Evola, there is the last phase, which, as you have mentioned, is the military expression of the socialist and collectivist states. So the within a communist context, where, according to traditionalist perspective, is the fourth social class, the one of the servants who start to rule the political system. So in this stage, the spiritual dimension of the war is completely denied. And furthermore, it is not only denied, but it opens spiritually to a sort of demonic and subpersonal dimension, which is even more dangerous in spiritual terms than the capitalistic use of war. So there is this interesting sort of morphology, which is a sort of translation of Evola's morphology of history into a phenomenology of war experiences. But at the same time, in my opinion, Evola's perspective is never fatalistic. And so there are many reflections and paragraphs which give us the idea that still in this negative and tragic Kali Yuga time, there is the opportunity for the individual to reconnect his identity with these traditional ethics of the warrior. And probably Ernst Jünger, the author you have mentioned, who was a very interesting source for Julius Evola, who was, by the way, in touch with Ernst Jünger, and who also worked on Ernst Jünger's text, especially writing a book on Jünger's The Worker, Der Arbeiter, represents, in Evola view, an example of a man who, despite fighting in this machinery, was able to give a symbolical interpretation of his experience, reaching heroic peak experience, and attributing to it, as it is shown in the beautiful Ernst Jünger's novels, a spiritual dimension to the fight, to the struggle. And this seems to me to be a sort of important Evola teaching, the idea not to get depressed due to the serious situation in which we are, but try to work at least on ourselves to be and to act as warrior, also maybe in not war situation. Because another comment we can add is that although in this text Evola primarily focus on the specific war context, it is clear that many spiritual teachings can be transferred also in civilian context. So to be a warrior doesn't just mean to fight with weapons, but also to fight for ideals, for political goals, for ethical and religious reasons. And this is something which is it's still very actual, I think.
Yeah. There's one very interesting thing about the Crusades that you mentioned. There's an essay about it, the meaning of the Crusades, here in this book. And the interesting thing is that Evola was highly critical of Christianity. He took the positions of Friedrich Nietzsche. He's seeing it as a kind of a religion of slaves with its equality and all this stuff. But on the other hand, he praised the medieval times. He used to see medieval times as the last great epoch of the West. And but the thing is, he said that another tradition uh, was visible in the Middle Ages. He said it's the Aryan heroics tradition, and the best example of it was the Crusades.
Yes, that's right. Evola's relationship with Christianity is very, very complex. We could maybe devote one discussion, one video in the future if you want to this
Yeah.
topic, which is really interesting. Um, Synthetically, I think we could understand Evola's interpretation of Middle Age Christianity has the survival within Christian forms and shapes of pre-Christian values and identities. So what Evola mostly loves within Crusades, Templars, and Middle Age perspective is paradoxically what is not just or only Christian. So he had this idea that this Indo-European Aryan tradition, which appeared in one of his best form within the tradition of Roman Empire, was won by Christianity, but then somehow survived within Christianity. And this relationship was somehow fruitful because some Indo-European values, forms, political structures, such as the one of empire, had the opportunity to survive and to gain a new power and new modes of expression. And in this sense, also the author of Pagan Imperialism could, in this context, appreciate Christian Middle Age Christianity. And then we should add that Evola's relationship with the Christian religion was multifaceted, and his argumentation also changed a little bit in relationship to the topic and to the period. And after the end of the Second World War, Evola, who clearly never became near to Christianity, however, elaborated, I will say, a more respectful position. There is a famous interview where he declared that in the Kali Yuga time, also if he was not Christian and if he recognized all the problematic aspect of the genesis of Christianity, which in his opinion was a not European Semitic tradition. However, probably due also to the capacity of Christianity to absorb some values, symbols, and traditions of European history. So in this period of crisis, at least to participate to the Christian liturgy, to go to the church, to try to somehow to be conservative, according to Evola, was something extremely better than to follow the process of modernization, of progress, of materialism. So in this sense, surely the Middle Age Christian orders of warriors represent probably one of the components of Christianity which Evola more appreciated. Together, I would like to mention with Dante Alighieri's theological, literary, and poetic opus, in which Evola always found a great source of wisdom.
Yes, and when it comes to the spiritual dimension of the war, there's one very famous essay here. The title is The Aryan Doctrine of Combat and Victory. And Evola writes, for the ancient Aryan, war had the general meaning of a perpetual fight between metaphysical powers. On the one hand, there was the Olympian principle of light, the Uranic and solar reality. On the other hand, brute violence, the titanic, telluric, barbaric element, in the classical sense, the feminine, demonic substance. The motive of this metaphysical fight resurfaces continually through countless forms of myth in all traditions of Aryan origin. Any fight, in the material sense, was experienced with greater or lesser awareness as an episode in that antithesis. But the Aryan race considered itself to be the army of the Olympian principle. Accordingly, it is necessary to restore this conception among Aryans as being the justification or the highest consecration of any hegemonic aspiration, but also of the very idea of empire, whose anti-secular character is basically very obvious. To the traditionally based worldview, all apparent realities are symbolic. This is therefore true of war as well as is seen from the subjective and interior point of view. War and the path of God are thus merged into a single entity. But what is the most important in this part? For the ancient Aryan, war had the general meaning of a perpetual fight between metaphysical powers. So this dimension of spirituality, that not only the armies are fighting each other on the battlefield, but in fact metaphysical principles are at war in that place.
Yes, this is very important, and it testifies Evola's symbolic and metaphysical interpretation of war, which should be contextualized in the more general traditionalist perspective. Every phenomenon which takes place in history, in the world of phenomena, in the world of becoming, is not just that, but it also reflects symbolically something more, something connected to transcendence. Walter Heinrich, who was an Austrian scholar and a friend of Evola, has written an interesting book in German, which has been translated into Italian, I think not in English, which is called On the Traditional Method. In German is Über die traditionelle Methode, where he tries to identify the core of traditionalism, and he speaks about the traditional method as the recognition of the interference between history and soprahistory or suprahistory. So this idea that everything which happens should be read in a symbolic way, should be read not just through human lens, but also as part of a cosmic evolution. And in this cosmic context, war is clearly the opposition between the good and the evil, the light and the dark, as you have read, quoting Evola's text. This gives us a different perspective on the concept of war. And the reference to Aryan tradition is particularly important, I think, to understand more generally Evola's spirituality, because the stress and the importance given to the spiritual function of war is part of the general importance which Evola has attributed to the role of action. His preference for the figure of the kshatriya, the warrior, which in the first pages of Evola's autobiography, The Path of the Cinnabar, is recognized as one of the two main tendencies of his own personality. So differently, this is well known, differently from Guénon, who was more focused on the contemplative dimension of metaphysics, Evola also stressed the active dimension, and so the possibility to translate metaphysics into action, not just contemplation. An action which needs to be clearly distinguished from the modern contemporary tendency to be active, to be still in the present. There is a scholar who defines this process presentism, so the ideology of the present. Also, the accelerationist tendencies could be compared to this modern attitude. Instead, what Evola proposed is a sort of active metaphysics, active spirituality, which means to follow that heroic path where it is the concrete practice through the use of body, through the self-sacrifice, through a very concrete ascesis, which allows the hero to reach the real connection with the God, with the divine. Speaking about discussing Aryan tradition, Evola reflects also, for example, on the topic of immortality, and he clarifies that in these archaic traditions, immortality was not given to everybody, but was a sort of aristocratic privilege for few, for that heroes who had the chance to become God, to access to use a German context, to Valhalla, or in the Greek tradition to become a semi-god or to access to Olympus, because the reign, the dominion of Hades was not that beautiful eternal place, but it was conceived as a dark domain where souls were progressively diminishing themselves and being forgotten. Here, Evola speaks as a historian of religions. He doesn't explicitly propose this view as the right one from a theological point of view, but it's clear that somehow he's near this position. There is a sort of fascination, and that's why I think the text on the metaphysics of war are very important, apart from the topic of war, but to understand Evola's own traditionalist reading, which is quite specific and, as we know, is different from other traditionalists in Catholic tradition or in Islamic tradition. This specific heroic path, which according to Evola was particularly important in the Kali Yuga, where all the traditional religions are in crisis, and is something which also the individual can try to follow. So metaphysics of war, if we give a symbolic reading, is really a sort of stoic, heroic pamphlet devoted to contemporary reader, to contemporary man, in order to apart from the specific religion to which we adhere, to follow in our interior life ethic, linear, coherent, and spiritually oriented direction.
Yes. Evola goes through different traditions in this book. He mentions a lot Bhagavad Gita, so ancient Indian text, which is known for its vision of heroic war, but he delves also into the world of Islam. That's very important because he wrote some things about Islam also, where in fact he praised Islam as more traditional than Christianity. And here he writes about Islam and the concept of lesser and greater war. In the Muslim tradition, in fact, we find the central nucleus of the whole order of ideas dealt with here in the theory of the twofold war. That is, of the lesser and greater jihad. The lesser war is the material war fought against a hostile people and in particular against an unjust one, the barbarians or infidels, in which case it becomes the lesser jihad, identical to the crusade in its outer, fanatical, and simply religious sense. The greater jihad is in contrast of the spiritual and interior order. It is the fight of man against the enemies which he bears within himself, or more exactly, the fight of the superhuman element in man against everything which is instinctual, passionate, and subject to natural forces. The condition for inner liberation is that these enemies, the infidels and barbarians within us, are pulled down and torn to shreds.
Yes, that's a very interesting quotation, and I think it's pretty clear here, distinguish between these two conception of war, of jihad within Islamic context. And in this sense, it's interesting that among the concrete historical examples, he also mentioned the mysterious group of the Ismail assassins of Alamut, which are mentioned as a sort of complementary order in Islam, as in Catholicism we had the Templars. So this sort of elite of aristocratic warriors, very connected with spirituality and with esotericism. And probably Evola's view on Islam was influenced by one of his most important source, René Guénon, who, as we know, at a certain point got converted, and he spent his last years in Egypt as within a Islamic community in a tariqa. But also in this context, Evola's perspective is quite peculiar and different from Guénon's one, because the focus in Guénon concerning Islam is on the theology, on the metaphysical ground of this tradition, on the contemplative dimension, as always. Whereas in Evola, as you have mentioned, the concept which more fascinates him is this active and somehow we could say barbaric dimension of the Islam. This idea that people are still ready to sacrifice themselves to fight for their God, for their values, and this is of course something also very actual in our contemporary age. Although, as we know, the idea of fight, which Evola discussed, is always, we have already repeated, connected to the traditional idea of war. So the this, I'm sure that the terroristic events which characterize the last decades will be highly criticized by him and contextualized within that kind of modern machinery and capitalistic war which characterize our age. So the nobility of the ethics of warrior is always something which needs to be proved also in behaviors based on the respect of the enemies and not in the massacre of civilians.
Yeah. There's one thing a little bit controversial, I might say. I think that if, I don't know if you will agree with me, if Evola were alive today and he would see the modern world, the Western world, which is becoming more and more degenerated year by year, I think he would say that if there is some kind of tradition left, we could find it only in the Islamic world, at least in some parts of it. And I think it's not a coincidence that René Guénon, when he started to delve into tradition, he decided to convert to Islam because he saw that only there this tradition is still alive. Because when we look at the West, the only part of traditional world that there was here, I mean Catholicism, because Guénon wrote about it, that Catholicism is the only link that the West has with real tradition. It has become so weak and degenerated that it's hard to find anything pure and traditional in it. There are some exceptions. I would say Archbishop Vigan is one of them. But if there is some kind of world of tradition left, it can be found in Islamic world. That's why René Guénon, I assume, that's why he chose to convert. And I think Evola, if he were alive today, he would say, let's look in that direction because the West is falling. It's got even worse than it was in 50s and 60s.
That's an interesting topic. I think that concerning the topic of war, specifically, I think you are probably right, because if we look also at the style of warfare we are producing and implementing is completely based on items and structures conceived in an opposite direction of the traditional idea of war. There is nothing conceived to challenge human, but drones, robots, and so on. Which there are many studies which show how much psychologically problematic is, for example, when you are directing a drone killing people in the other part of the world and you're sitting maybe in your room with no risk, no pressure. And there are many studies which show the counter effect also from a psychological point of view of this practice. However, there are many comments on Islam by Evola which show the great interest he had on this tradition, but it's also necessary to underline how much Evola was personally involved in the rediscovery of this Indo-European Western tradition. So Guénon was more East-oriented, so to speak, due to his idea of tradition. Evola, as we see also, for example, in Riding the Tiger, never thought, apparently at least, as long as I know, to a conversion. because he felt very much from a metaphysical point of view as a European man. And this, of course, posed many problems because in his perspective, there was no more active and positive tradition. And the origin of a text, such as Riding the Tiger, depends, I think, precisely on this interior conflict, the necessity to find a path which is traditional, which is somehow European, connected to Western tradition and wisdom, but which cannot properly, organically relate to a single religious tradition. So in this text, for example, Evola refers several times to the spirituality of the ancient Stoics, the Stoicism as this philosophy which had also a spiritual and so somehow religious aspect, which according to him was a good source of knowledge for that modern man who had no more a living connection with religious tradition, but wanted to be somehow faithful to his own rootness, genealogy, and spirituality.
So, Luca, to conclude our talk, I will repeat what I said at the beginning, that it's one of the most fascinating books by Evola, at least the compilation of his texts, as he has not published this book by himself. And it gives you this sense of something different than the modern world that is so full of materialistic spirit, the capitalism, the craziness about the money, about well-being, about making some kind of career, having a nice, pretty, cozy life. And here comes Evola with those texts, and he's reaching out to different traditions, to history of the mankind, and showing us that a different world was there. This different world, in fact, created also Europe and European civilization, and it was created by knights and aristocrats and the church that was very different than what it is now. So there's a huge contrast between our modern capitalistic, materialistic world of Netflix and HBO and Hollywood, and Evola reaching to the depths of the history and that taking out that heroic spirit.
Yes. If you allow me, I would like just to conclude at least my interview in my part with a quotation, which is taken from the article "The Metaphysics of War," which I think is really a good conclusion to my presentation, because it's the description, and you will see how much fascinating and also poetic is, of the spiritual condition of the man during the awakening, which takes place if he's capable to experience the war through the lens of transcendence, but without letting be destroyed by this power, because the energy, material but also spiritual, which emerge in the war, is something extremely powerful and dangerous. And in this paragraph, Evola writes, describing this condition. We arrive at this general vision of life, like electrical bulbs, too brightly lit, like circuits invested with too high a potential. Human beings fall and die only because a power bursts within them, which transcends their finitude, which goes beyond everything they can do and want. This is why they develop, reach a peak, and then, as if overwhelmed by the wave which up to a given point had carried them forward, sink, dissolve, die, and return to the unmanifest. But the one who does not fear death, the one who is able, so to speak, to assume the powers of death by becoming everything which it destroys, overwhelms and shatters. This one finally passes beyond limitation. He continues to remain upon the crest of the wave. He does not fall, and what is beyond life manifests itself within him.
Beautiful, beautiful, really beautiful. As this book, and of course other books by Evola, but I urge anyone to read this one. It's really incredible, and I think if you want to fall in love in Evola and his work, this is even a good beginning. Luca, thank you very much for your insight and very interesting opinions and the history that you shared here with us. And I hope we will talk about Evola many, many more times to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marius, for the invitation, and thank you for all the viewers. And of course, there will be other chances to meet again.
Yes, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.